A woman walks into a bank to withdraw her own money, only to be humiliated, slapped, and handcuffed by the very staff she employs. What they didn't know, she's the CEO, and she owns the entire building they're standing in. You won't believe what happens when the truth finally comes out. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Alexis Moore had built her career on listening, really listening, to people no one else bothered to hear. At 45, she was the founder and CEO of Harbor West Bank, a growing chain of community-focused financial institutions scattered across the country. Not the kind of place that looked down on someone because of the shoes they wore or the zip code they came from. At least, that's what she believed. But lately, whispers had been circling. A couple of young associates had quietly approached her office during lunch hours. An email here, a voicemail there, nothing formal. Just subtle mentions of a few branch locations where customers who didn't look a certain way or speak a certain way were treated differently. Not outright denied service, but delayed, dismissed, looked at twice before being looked at straight. One name came up more than once, Branch 12, located in a quiet business strip outside the city. Its track record for complaints wasn't alarming, but something about the pattern didn't sit right. Alexis had learned long ago that red flags don't always wave loudly. Sometimes, they whisper. So, she made a choice. No media teams, no advance notice, no high heels or signature blazer. Just her, a pair of sneakers, jeans, a faded olive jacket, and a black baseball cap pulled low. No makeup, no jewelry, no hint that she was anything other than a middle-aged black woman trying to handle her banking on a Friday afternoon. She walked into Branch 12 as a Moore, carrying only her ID, a corporate debit card, and a quiet purpose. The lobby was calm, neutral tones on the walls, a few houseplants by the window, two people ahead of her in line. The security guard near the entrance stood straight but casual, arms crossed. He gave her a once-over but didn't say anything. Yet, when her turn came, Alexis stepped up to the counter and greeted the young teller with a polite nod. "I'd like to withdraw $75,000 from this business account," she said evenly, sliding her ID and card across the counter. The teller blinked, lips tightening almost imperceptibly. He glanced at her, then at the card, then back again. Something flickered in his expression, hesitation, maybe confusion. He nodded once, typed a few things, then paused. "I'll just need to verify a few details," he said, his voice trailing as he pressed a button under the desk. Alexis noticed. She'd designed that system herself. The silent alert wasn't always a cause for alarm, but it wasn't casual either. "Sure," she replied calmly, watching his hands closely. "Take your time." She stepped back slightly, giving him space, and folded her arms loosely. Her eyes swept the room. The man behind her had moved to the side, pretending not to watch. The woman in the corner with a tablet glanced up from time to time. The security guard, broad-shouldered, white, mid-50s, with the weary air of someone who'd been in the job too long, was now shifting his stance. Looking directly at her, she caught the moment his eyes narrowed. Not at her card, not at her ID, but at her, the way her hair was tied back, the cut of her jeans, the fact that she didn't carry a purse. It was always subtle at first, the kind of suspicion that hung in the air like static before a storm. Still, Alexis didn't move. She knew how this worked. She also knew who she was. But for the moment, she let the silence grow. Whatever was coming, she needed to see it unfold, fully, clearly, without interruption. Because sometimes, the only way to uncover what's rotten underneath is to stand still and let the cracks rise to the surface. Robert Kane had the kind of face that rarely changed expression, stone-set jaw, narrowed eyes, and a permanent crease between his brows that made him look perpetually unimpressed. At 58, he'd spent more than 2 decades working security, and if you asked him, he'd tell you that he could spot trouble just by the way someone walked through a door. And today, as Alexis stood quietly at the counter in that faded green jacket and worn sneakers, Robert decided she was trouble. He approached slowly, like a man expecting confrontation, his boots landing heavy on the polished tile. He positioned himself just behind the teller and tilted his chin toward Alexis, scanning her from head to toe like he was checking inventory that didn't quite add up. "You said you want to withdraw how much?" he asked, voice flat but edged with judgment. Alexis turned slightly, meeting his stare without blinking. 75,000. From a corporate account under my name. Robert scoffed. "Right, and I'm supposed to believe that?" The teller hesitated. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, eyes darting between Alexis and the security guard. No one said a word to stop Robert. That silence stretched, sticky and uncomfortable. "I'm going to need to see some real ID," Robert continued, folding his arms. "Not just some card you pulled out of a wallet." "I gave the required documents to the teller," Alexis said, her tone even, deliberate. "They matched the account information." He ignored her. "You think I haven't seen this before? Someone rolls in dressed like that, claims to own a business account, and thinks I'll just hand over 75 grand? Alexis didn't move. "I'd like to speak to the branch manager." "Please." Robert shook his head. "Nope, not happening. Until we get this sorted. I'm treating this as a possible fraud case." "You're making a mistake." "No, ma'am, you are." He tapped the walkie clip to his shoulder. "Calling this in could be part of a bigger scam." The teller's face flushed pale, but he said nothing. A woman in line took a subtle step back. A man near the entrance pulled out his phone and started scrolling, pretending not to listen. Alexis drew in a slow breath. "You have my ID. You have my account number. If there's any question about my identity, I'm happy to verify it through the system right here." Robert's voice rose just enough to turn heads. "Yeah, I've heard that before. Look, I'm not trying to argue with you, but I've been doing this long enough to know what smells off. You show up with no appointment, no professional attire, and expect to walk out with that kind of money? That's not how we do business here." She didn't reply, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was measuring the room now, the way no one stepped in, the way the teller's eyes stayed glued to the screen, the way even the posters on the walls, boasting values like trust and community, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. Robert reached for the phone behind the counter. "Stay right there," he ordered, then dialed 911. "Yeah, this is branch 12. I've got a suspected fraud situation." Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers entered through the glass doors. One tall and young, the other middle-aged with a worn leather notepad tucked under his arm. They approached Alexis slowly, as if they weren't quite sure what they were walking into. "Ma'am, we need to ask for your ID," one of them said. Alexis handed it over without hesitation. Her fingers didn't tremble, her face didn't flinch. The officer looked at her ID, then at the name on the account printout handed to him by the teller. He double-checked it, then paused. "Hold on," he said, flipping the ID to the back. He handed it to his partner, who studied it a moment longer. The younger officer looked up. "Miss Moore, can I ask what you do for a living?" Alexis raised her head fully now. Her voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the clarity. "I'm the founder and CEO of Harbor West Bank. I built this place. I own this building, and the branch you're standing in." Silence hit the room like a dropped plate. The teller stepped back, mouth open but empty of words. Robert stood frozen, jaw slack, the color draining from his face like water down a sink. The officers exchanged a quick glance, then moved with sudden urgency. "We're sorry, ma'am," one of them said, handing back her ID. "This shouldn't have happened." They unfastened the cuffs they hadn't dared use yet and muttered apologies before backing away, unsure of where to look. No one else spoke, not the other customers, not the employees behind the counter. The lobby had turned into a vacuum of shame. Alexis turned slowly toward Robert, who still hadn't found his voice. Before leaving, she looked around once more. Her eyes paused on the teller, then drifted over each face like a quiet reckoning. "Sometimes," she said softly, "a test isn't to see who fails. It's to see how deep the cracks really run." Then she walked out, not in anger, but in clarity. And behind her, the weight of what had just happened settled in the air like dust that would not be swept away. The automatic doors of Branch 12 had barely closed behind her when Alexis felt the weight of what had just happened settle deep in her chest. She didn't storm out, didn't slam doors, didn't raise her voice, but inside, a quiet ache had opened up. Sharp and slow. The kind that didn't fade with time. Back at Harbor West Bank headquarters, she moved through the building with the calm precision of someone who knew the walls and hallways better than most knew their own homes. No one stopped her, and no one dared ask why she looked more solemn than usual. As soon as she reached her office, Alexis removed the small camera clipped discreetly to her glasses. She plugged it into her desktop, took a breath, and pressed play. The footage rolled without pause. Robert's voice, edged with suspicion, the tight-lipped teller, the silent glances from other staff, and her own steady responses. She watched it all again, without blinking. What hurt most wasn't the accusation. It was the way no one stepped in, not even to ask a question. She didn't waste time. Alexis picked up her phone and called Madeline Tran. Madeline arrived within minutes, notebook in hand, brows already knit with concern. She didn't need details, she could read the room. A second-generation Vietnamese American, Madeline had been Harbor West's director of communications for nearly 7 years. She didn't speak often in meetings, but when she did, people listened. Alexis greeted her with a brief nod, then turned the monitor toward her and played the footage again. Madeline didn't say a word until the video ended. "Has this gone public?" "Not from us," Alexis said, "but I have a feeling that won't matter." Her instinct was right. Downstairs in the media monitoring center, a junior analyst flagged a trending post on a financial forum. A grainy cell phone clip, shakier but unmistakably the same incident. The caption read, "A black woman humiliated at Harbor West just for dressing plain and trying to access her own account." The thread had hundreds of comments and was climbing fast. Some people speculated about the bank's policies. Others asked who the woman was. A few users shared their own stories, smaller moments, but similar tones. Alexis gave Madeline a look. "We need to be ready. Internally and publicly." Madeline nodded. "Give me 2 hours. I'll write both versions, one for the board and one for the press." While Madeline got to work, Alexis turned to another concern that had been gnawing at her all week. She called in the internal audit team, quietly and without alerting middle management. "I want every customer discrimination-related complaint from the past year on my desk by tonight," she said. "No filters, no summaries. I want the raw numbers." When the file landed on her desk hours later, Alexis scanned it carefully. 38 incidents, most marked, addressed, but without real follow-up. A few were logged with vague notes like, "customer misunderstanding," or, "issue resolved verbally." She set the papers down and leaned back in her chair. The room felt colder now, as if something she had once trusted had shifted beneath her feet. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Madeline stepped in, holding her tablet. "There's more," she said, her tone unusually tight. "3 members of the audit team say they've raised concerns before, but those reports never made it to you." Alexis's eyes narrowed. "Who stopped them?" "Looks like most of the blocks came from one level. Henry Dalton." The name dropped like a rock in a pond. Henry had been with Harbor West since nearly the beginning. A regional director with influence over a dozen branches. He ran things tightly, took pride in performance metrics, and always seemed to know how to dodge negative attention. Now Alexis saw the pattern. Henry wasn't just sweeping things under the rug. He was managing the optics, keeping the surface clean while rot spread underneath. She looked back at the footage again, then at the name Robert Kane on the report. This wasn't just one man acting out, she said softly. It was a culture someone let grow. Before the day ended, Alexis issued a directive. Henry Dalton was to be suspended pending further investigation. And Branch 12 was to shut down temporarily for internal review. No press release yet, no public naming, not until the next step was in place. That evening, long after the building had quieted, Alexis sat alone in her office and pulled out a business card from an old leather file tucked in the back of her drawer. She stared at the name, Eliza King, a civil rights attorney with a razor-sharp mind and a long memory. They'd met back in college, when Eliza helped her through a case involving housing discrimination. They hadn't spoken in years. Alexis tapped the number into her phone and waited. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Eliza," Alexis said quietly. "It's me. You got time to help me look into something? I think I just peeled back the first layer of something much worse." A pause. Then Eliza's voice came through, steady as ever. Tell me where to start. Eliza King arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, dressed in a simple navy suit with a brown leather bag tucked under her arm. Her steps were steady, her eyes alert but calm, and as she entered Harbor West's headquarters, no one needed to ask why she was there. Her reputation had arrived a few minutes before she did. Alexis met her in the executive lounge, already halfway through her first coffee. They exchanged a brief hug, warm but focused, then got to work. There wasn't room for nostalgia. Eliza started by reviewing the preliminary reports from the internal audit team. Then, she requested interviews with several former employees who had submitted complaints in the last 2 years. The first to respond was Jamal Green. Jamal walked in with his shoulders slightly hunched, but his handshake was firm. He had once worked at Branch 12 in customer relations. 5 months ago, he walked away after what the system labeled as a voluntary departure. But his eyes told a different story. Seated across from Eliza, he took a moment before speaking. It wasn't just one incident, he said, it was how they handled it after. I tried to defend a customer, an older black man, just trying to deposit a check. He didn't speak clearly, had trouble hearing. The teller dismissed him like he was a scammer. Jamal explained how he'd flagged the interaction, wrote it up, and sent it to his supervisor. That note disappeared, he said, not just deleted, scrubbed, and when I followed up, I got pulled into a private meeting where they told me I needed to stop overreacting or I'd be unfit for a customer-facing role. He looked down, voice low. They told me I could either stop making noise, or I'd find myself on a list. And in banking, once you're on that list, it follows you. Eliza listened carefully, jotting down every detail. She asked about the documentation, and Jamal pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. I saved what I could, he said, screenshots, partial call logs, copies of my original report. I figured one day someone might actually care. While Eliza followed that thread, Madeline was deep in another one. With clearance from Alexis, she and a forensic IT analyst began combing through archived internal emails, searching for anything tied to Henry Dalton. They didn't have to look far. Over 24 messages surfaced. Many were vague, carefully worded, but the intent was clear. Phrases like, prioritize well-presented clientele, and exercise discretion with questionable walk-ins, came up again and again. There were also attachments, unofficial training slides. They weren't part of the main employee portal. These were circulated directly from Henry's team to branch managers. One slide read, visual cues can tell you a lot. Trust your instincts. Another showed side-by-side photos, one of a man in a business suit, one in work clothes, and asked which one should be offered premier services first. Madeline forwarded everything to Alexis with a short message. We have a culture problem. And it was built deliberately. But the final blow came from an unexpected place. One of the IT engineers stumbled upon an audio file buried in a secured folder, tagged as a routine meeting recording. It wasn't routine at all. The clip captured Henry's voice, clear and unmistakable, during what sounded like a strategy meeting with regional managers. He said, we cater to high-value clients. If someone walks in wearing sweats and wants to open a business account, especially if they're black or brown, I want double verification. We're not here to take on risk from the wrong demographic. Alexis played the audio 3 times. Each time, it hit harder than the last. She didn't shout. She didn't call anyone into her office. She simply sat for a long moment, her hands folded, her jaw set tight. Then she turned to Eliza. I want a plan, she said, one that doesn't just clean the surface. I want it deep, permanent, and public. Together, they drafted a 3-phase strategy. Phase 1. A full investigation covering the last 24 months. Targeting every complaint, every flag, every inconsistency, no matter how minor. Phase 2. A new internal policy labeled zero tolerance. Any act of discrimination, verbal, behavioral, structural, would result in immediate dismissal, regardless of rank. Phase 3. A national press conference. Alexis would speak directly, no PR filters. Eliza would join her as an independent legal observer. The truth wouldn't just be released, it would be owned. Late that night, Alexis stood by her office window overlooking the city skyline. The lights below blinked and shimmered, Too distant to touch but impossible to ignore. Her reflection stared back at her. Tired but sharp. She thought about the first branch she ever opened, how she'd painted the walls herself. How she'd sat with customers who had never walked into a bank before in their lives. This wasn't about restoring her name anymore. It was about protecting what that name used to mean. Henry Dalton arrived 20 minutes early. Like a man used to controlling the tempo of the room. He wore his usual charcoal gray suit, pressed to perfection, and carried a leather folder he didn't bother to open. His eyes moved slowly across the hallway of Harbor West's executive floor before he stepped into the conference room without knocking. Inside, Alexis sat at the head of the table, composed and focused. To her right was Eliza King, cool-eyed and unreadable. On her left, Madeline Tran was already reviewing a printed timeline with tabs and highlights running down the margins. Henry's lips curled slightly when he saw the lineup. "Feels like a trial," he said casually, pulling out a chair. Alexis didn't respond to the bait. She waited until he was seated and the door clicked shut. "This isn't a trial," she said. "It's a conversation. One I hope you'll take seriously." Henry folded his hands on the table, wearing that kind of smile that never touched the eyes. "Of course." Alexis slid a stack of documents toward him. "These are internal emails, sent from your account. They include directives about customer profiling, unofficial training guidance, and managerial summaries from at least 4 branches under your supervision." Henry glanced down, didn't touch the papers. "Without context, those emails mean nothing. You know how easily words can be twisted." "Then let's look at context," Eliza said calmly, laying out a second stack. "We have matching testimonies from 3 former employees, including a former team lead and a branch assistant manager. They describe a clear, consistent pattern, targeting certain customer groups, discouraging service to others." She handed him a summary chart, organized by location and date. "It's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Dalton. It's a strategy, one designed and repeated under your watch." Henry raised an eyebrow but kept his tone steady. "You really think this is going to stick? You think the board will let you run with this?" He turned his gaze to Alexis now, and the smile sharpened. "You're a strong speaker, Alexis. But being right doesn't always mean staying in power." Alexis didn't blink. "So you're saying power justifies undermining every value this bank was built on?" He chuckled, low and smug. "What I'm saying is, loyalty still matters. And I happen to be very close with 2 of your most generous backers, board members who remember the early days of your funding rounds. You want to go public with this? Go ahead, just be ready for what comes back." He leaned in slightly. "I know about certain discrepancies in those original capital reports, the ones never formally reviewed. And let's not forget a few generous disbursements to outside consultants no one really questioned." Madeline looked up, eyes narrowing, but Alexis remained still. "If I've made mistakes in the past," she said quietly, "I'll own them, but this isn't about me anymore. This is about what you've done, and how far you're willing to drag this institution through the mud to protect yourself." Henry sat back, tapping the edge of the table with his index finger. "We'll see who drags who. Alexis." He stood and buttoned his jacket. "I'll wait for your formal notice. And in the meantime, I'll be speaking with my legal team. And a few friends." He left without another word. The room stayed silent for a moment after the door closed. Madeline was the first to speak. "He's bluffing. If he had anything real, he'd have dropped it already." Alexis nodded slowly. "Probably. But he's not alone in this. People like Henry, they survive by knowing where the cracks are, and making sure no one sees who's standing behind them." She looked over at Eliza, who was already scrolling through messages on her phone. "Eliza?" The lawyer looked up. "I got something. A text from someone I worked with back in Chicago. Former senior compliance officer from one of your early branches. Left 2 years ago, quietly. What's he saying? He wants to talk. Said he knows how deep this really goes. But he won't email, won't call, won't put anything in writing. He'll meet in person, neutral ground. No cameras." Alexis nodded slowly. "Set it up," she said. "If he's willing to speak, it means he's carrying something heavy." She didn't say it aloud, but they all knew what was at stake now. It wasn't just about Henry. It wasn't even just about the bank. It was about the unseen engine behind the scenes, the quiet machinery that made decisions with a smile and buried people with silence. As the evening light dimmed outside her office, Alexis sat for a while without speaking. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the glass. And for the first time in days, she looked not at what had happened, but at what was coming. The cafe sat on the edge of a sleepy street lined with cracked sidewalks and quiet brick storefronts. A bell above the door gave a soft jingle when Alexis stepped inside. And the smell of burnt espresso and old wood greeted her like an old friend. She scanned the room. Nothing fancy. No cameras. No curious glances. Just the low hum of conversation and a barista humming off-key behind the counter. Thomas Reyes was already seated near the back, at a table half shadowed by a dusty potted plant. He looked older than she remembered, his salt and pepper beard thicker. Eyes more cautious. He wore a dark jacket zipped halfway up and kept one hand wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug. As if grounding himself, Alexis approached slowly. No bodyguards, no briefcase, just herself. He looked up, met her gaze, and gave a small nod. "Thanks for coming," she said as she took the chair across from him. Thomas offered a dry smile. "Didn't think I'd ever hear from Harbor West again. Especially not from you." "I didn't come as a CEO today," she replied. "I came as someone trying to figure out how deep this thing goes." He stirred the coffee absent-mindedly, then leaned back. "Deep enough that I stopped sleeping right. That's why I left." Their words hovered in the space between them, tentative and heavy. Alexis knew not to rush him. After a long pause, Thomas began. "A year before I left, Henry started pulling new regional managers into private sessions. Not official onboarding. He called them culture briefings. Off-site places, private homes, sometimes hotels. No records." He looked down. He'd call it protecting the integrity of the bank. Said it was about preserving performance standards. But that wasn't it. Alexis leaned in. What was it really about? Thomas's fingers tapped against his mug. It was about trimming the tree. Removing the wrong kind of customer. He had a whole language for it. Never said race outright. But you didn't have to be a genius to read between the lines. He explained how Henry had distributed a set of unofficial materials. Nothing digital. All hard copies. Diagrams showing risk profiles tied to zip codes. Phrases like target demographic preference and containment strategies were scribbled across diagrams like footnotes to some dark doctrine. "I spoke up once," Thomas said, told him what he was doing wasn't just unethical, it was dangerous. He smiled, told me I didn't understand the stakes. Alexis watched him closely. "So why didn't you come forward then?" "I tried." His voice dropped. "I recorded a meeting. Just one. Thought I had something. Within a week, I got called into a board liaison meeting. I wasn't fired, but I was cornered. Quiet pressure. They made it clear if I didn't walk away, I'd never work in finance again." "And you believed them?" He nodded. "Back then, yeah, but I held on to something. Not because I was scared, but because I needed to know whether this bank still had a soul." Thomas reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a tiny USB drive. He placed it between them like an offering. "I kept this. I wasn't sure if I'd ever hand it over. But I've been watching. I saw what happened at Branch 12. I saw how you didn't hide behind PR." Alexis picked it up carefully, then met his eyes. "What's on it?" "A meeting. Henry with 3 regional managers. They didn't know I was still connected to the room system. I hit record before they disconnected from the main line." Alexis didn't wait. She pulled her laptop from her bag, plugged in the USB, and opened the single file stored inside. The audio buzzed briefly, then cleared. Henry's voice came through first, calm, confident, almost bored. "If the CEO wants to play equality games, let her," he said. "We'll stick to real numbers. Make the branches look clean. Squeeze out risky segments. And if she pushes too far, we make her look weak. The board won't protect someone who tanks the balance sheet." There was laughter. Then another voice added, "What if she goes public?" Henry responded without pause. "Then we push her out. She loses credibility. She built this place, but she won't outlast it." Alexis stared at the screen, fingers curling into a fist on her lap. This wasn't policy violation. This was betrayal at the highest level, coordinated, deliberate, and systemic. She shut the laptop. The cafe was suddenly too quiet. The distant hiss of the espresso machine the only sound breaking the tension. "Do you want your name attached to this?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, not yet, but if you go forward, I'll back you from behind the curtain." "I'm done being silent." She stood, thanked him, and walked out with the USB in her coat pocket. The city outside felt sharper now. Brighter, but colder. Back at headquarters, Alexis didn't wait for the next board meeting or the scheduled press conference. She called Madeline and Eliza into her office. "We're not waiting anymore," she said as they sat down. "The rules change. We go public now. Full statement, full exposure. I want the board, the media, and every employee in the loop." Madeline looked up. "Are you sure?" Alexis nodded slowly. "If they've been working in the dark this long, it's time we turn the lights all the way on." And just like that, the clock started ticking toward a moment that would redefine not just Harbor West, but the very soul of who it claimed to serve. The morning sun hadn't yet warmed the city streets when inboxes across the financial world lit up. A single subject line cut through the clutter like a flare in the fog. "Unmasking the system. CEO Alexis Moore speaks on justice, truth, and reform." Within an hour, the news had reached every major outlet. By mid-morning, hashtags like #StandWithAlexis and #HarborWestReckoning were trending across platforms. Then came the video. The original footage, recorded by Alexis herself at Branch 12, now fully authenticated and time-stamped, spread like fire through social media. It showed her quiet composure, the disbelief in the voices around her, and that one unforgettable sentence: "I am the founder and CEO of this bank." Across comment threads and newsroom panels, people responded with a mixture of shock, fury, and respect. For many, the image of a black woman being dismissed, challenged, and nearly arrested in her own institution was not just a story, it was a symbol. A moment of raw truth that echoed their own silent battles. Inside Harbor West's headquarters, the atmosphere was tense but electric. In the private prep room just off the media hall, Alexis stood in front of a mirror, straightening the lapels of her gray blazer. No makeup artist, no stylist, just Eliza King and Madeline Tran by her side. "You ready?" Madeline asked softly, adjusting the mic clip to Alexis's collar. Alexis nodded once. "It's time." Eliza, arms folded and voice calm, looked her in the eye. "A piece of the truth stirs people. But the whole truth? That shakes foundations." The doors opened, the lights hit, the cameras turned, and Alexis Moore stepped onto the stage. She walked to the podium slowly, deliberately, and looked out over the crowd. It wasn't just journalists and analysts. Employees from various branches, former customers, members of the public, all had come, standing shoulder to shoulder in the packed room. "I want to start," Alexis said, her voice low but steady, with an apology. A wave of silence swept over the room. "I built this institution with the hope that it would be a place where fairness wasn't an aspiration, it was a standard. But hope isn't enough, and the truth is, beneath the policies, beneath the branding, something went wrong, and I didn't see it soon enough." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to land. "Last week, I visited Branch 12 in person. Not as the CEO, not with cameras or security, just as a customer. What happened to me there was not an isolated event. It was the result of something deeper." She clicked the remote, and the room's screens lit up. The video played, her hidden footage, the confrontation, the cold dismissal, the police. When it ended, Alexis looked up. "But this is not just about one branch. Today, I am releasing findings from an internal investigation that spans the last 24 months. Incidents flagged, complaints buried, evidence scrubbed." She gestured to a new slide, email excerpts, all traced back to regional directors. And then, the audio file from Thomas Reyes, as Henry Dalton's voice filled the room, speaking of risk profiles and removing the CEO if necessary. A visible chill ran through the crowd. Journalists stopped typing, phones lowered, eyes widened. Those voices, Alexis continued, belonged to individuals who were entrusted with power, and used it not to serve, but to divide. She didn't flinch when she named them. Henry Dalton, Lisa McCree, Victor Sloan, Greg Ramirez. These individuals orchestrated a covert campaign, not only to discriminate against certain customer groups, but to undermine leadership they saw as too committed to fairness. The reporters murmured, stunned. This was not corporate deflection. It was surgical exposure. Alexis took a breath. But this ends now. She laid out the reforms clearly. Without ceremony. The entire regional management structure will be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. A new ethics oversight board will be formed, independent, with full investigative authority, and reporting outside the executive chain. And starting immediately, every employee, from teller to vice president, will undergo mandatory training on equity, implicit bias, and community accountability, facilitated by civil rights experts. The applause didn't come right away. It started in pockets, a few claps, then more, until the room erupted. Alexis waited, let it crest. Then she spoke again, her voice raspier now. I've made mistakes. I've missed signs. But I refuse to watch something I created become a weapon against the very people I meant to serve. She looked into the cameras, eyes unwavering. We don't get to claim values in our mission statements unless we live them in our decisions. In that moment, Alexis wasn't just a CEO on a podium. She was a person reclaiming her place, not just at the head of a company, but in the fight for its soul. As the cameras panned across the crowd, there were tears, nods, applause, but above all, there was something harder to define. A collective breath held, and finally released. Because someone had told the whole truth. And the world had listened. The day after the press conference felt like breathing fresh air after weeks underground. Alexis sat in her office, reading through letters that poured in from customers around the country, some handwritten, some emailed. Many of them began with, "Thank you." People thanked her not just for the reforms, but for showing up, for speaking plainly, for standing when it would have been easier to hide. News outlets ran coverage all day. Financial commentators, civil rights advocates, even former competitors, many came forward praising her transparency and resolve. For the first time in a long while, Alexis saw Harbor West's name trending for something other than controversy. It almost felt like a turning point. But not everyone was celebrating. Deep inside a private suite at a downtown hotel, Henry Dalton leaned back in a leather chair, swirling bourbon in a crystal glass as he eyed the two men seated across from him. David Lyles and Meredith Flynn, two long-standing board members, both with deep ties to Harbor West's earliest investors. Henry didn't waste words. "She's going to burn this place down," he said. "You saw the headlines. We lose confidence in the markets. And the stock takes a hit. We lose everything." David tapped his pen against a notepad. "What do you propose?" Henry leaned in. "We trigger a temporary suspension. Board mandated. Publicly framed as a move to stabilize the company image while an independent review investigates her handling of internal protocols." Meredith frowned. "And the authority to remove a sitting CEO?" Henry nodded. "It's in the bylaws. Clause 19B. Emergency governance override. We just need a majority." They didn't shake hands. They didn't raise voices. But the plan was in motion by the time Henry left the room. Later that evening, while Alexis was reviewing policy drafts in her home office, her phone buzzed. A message from Madeline flashed on the screen. "Call me. It's urgent." Alexis dialed immediately. "I just got word from someone inside legal," Madeline said, voice low and tense. "Henry's trying to invoke an emergency clause. He wants the board to vote to suspend you pending review." Alexis didn't speak for a moment. "There's more," Madeline added. "He's compiling old financial reports. I don't know how, but he's trying to tie you to early expenditures, claiming there were undocumented disbursements from year one." Alexis felt her chest tighten. The first year of Harbor West had been chaotic. Funding rounds, travel, small office setups in cities where they had nothing more than folding chairs and hope. She'd signed dozens of approvals. Many rushed, most eventually accounted for, but not all with perfect precision. That night, Eliza arrived with a flash drive in her hand. She'd also been contacted anonymously by someone in the IT department. "He's building a case," Eliza said flatly. "The email strings have been doctored, time stamps rewritten, but someone inside doesn't want to be part of it anymore. They sent me this." Henry's private folder directory. Alexis took the flash drive and plugged it in. File after file appeared, PDFs, internal memos, even a mock-up of a press release calling for her suspension. She read the opening lines. In the interest of restoring confidence and preserving institutional integrity. She sat back. The irony nearly made her laugh. Before she could speak, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She picked up, cautious. "This is Alexis." A man's voice. Calm. Clipped. "Jared Collins. From the board." Alexis straightened. Jared was the youngest member of Harbor West's board. A venture capitalist who'd made a name investing in ethical tech. He was considered neutral, smart, but unpredictable. "I figured I owed you a call," he said. "Henry reached out. He's trying to lock down a vote of no confidence. He wants me on his side." Alexis waited, not pressing. "I don't play politics," Jared said, "but I watched your video. All of it, and I thought, damn, that took guts." "What do you want to know?" she asked. "I want to be in the room, not hidden behind vote tallies or summaries. I want to see who says what. I want transparency." Alexis. "Then come to the hearing," she said. "You sit in as an observer. No speeches. Just watch. I'll let the facts speak." He paused. "Then, you've got a deal." As the call ended, Alexis turned to Eliza. "We hit them with everything," she said, "but not just to defend me. We show exactly how they operate. Where the decisions start. Who's benefited from keeping things quiet." Eliza nodded. "And the expenditures? I'll answer for every cent," Alexis said, "even the ones I wish I'd handled better." Across town, beneath the steel skeleton of the board's parking tower, a shadow moved between cars. A maintenance worker bent down, pretending to fix a license plate on Henry's black sedan. In his hand, he held a small magnetic device, smaller than a car key, disguised like a roadside tracker. He pressed it into place under the bumper. The click was barely audible. Then he walked away without looking back. In this game of power, someone had just changed teams. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual. Alexis stood silently, hands clasped behind her back, as Eliza and Madeline flanked her on either side. The silence wasn't awkward, it was loaded. Loaded with the weight of months of investigation, betrayal, and the hope that today might finally tilt the balance. The doors opened to the boardroom. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp lines across the polished oak table. Around it sat the 11 members of the Harbor West Bank Board of Directors. Some old enough to have voted on Alexis's first appointment. Others newer, brought in during the company's rapid expansion. The mood was thick with anticipation. Jared Collins nodded as Alexis entered, his expression neutral but his eyes attentive. He had become something of an anomaly, young, strategic, and, for once, not already bought. At the far end of the table sat Meredith Flynn, board secretary, who called the meeting to order with her usual crispness. Today's session has one agenda item: a review of recent actions taken by CEO Alexis Moore and deliberation on her continuing suitability in the role. A murmur rippled as Henry Dalton's legal counsel stood. Henry himself was absent, of course. He'd learned enough to keep his hands clean in public. But his lawyer, a gray-haired man named Bernard Alston, moved smoothly to the center with a thick folder in hand. "The board has a fiduciary duty to ensure this institution's stability," Alston began, voice calm, rehearsed. "In light of recent events, particularly the unsanctioned public disclosure of internal investigations and the publication of non-verified footage, we submit that Ms. Moore has overstepped the scope of her role." He opened the folder and handed out printed documents to each board member. "In addition," he continued, "we submit this financial review, which highlights questionable expenditures from the Employee Welfare Fund during fiscal years 1 and 2. These entries, totaling over $400,000, remain undocumented in any formal approval records." The room was quiet. Jared didn't speak yet. Alexis waited, her face unreadable. Then Eliza rose. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Members of the board," she said, laying out another stack of documents. "I'd like to present the original financial statements, pulled directly from the company's secured archives, and compare them to the documents Mr. Alston has just distributed." She clicked a remote, bringing up a screen behind her with 2 columns. One labeled, "Submitted by Defense." The other, "Verified Records." Line by line, she walked them through the differences. A changed date here, a rounded figure there, then, A clear deletion, an entire note on a staff retreat that had been reframed as unauthorized travel. Her final slide showed the internal access log. There is only one user account with clearance high enough to make these changes without triggering an automatic audit. She paused. Henry Dalton. Gasps whispered across the room. Even those loyal to Henry exchanged glances. Eliza folded her hands. This isn't about a misunderstanding. It's manufactured evidence, intended to discredit a leader who exposed a culture that should have been corrected years ago. Jared finally spoke. If we make this about saving face, we're choosing comfort over character. Alexis Moore stood in front of the entire nation and told the truth. If this board punishes her for that, we'll be remembered not for protecting the bank, but for preserving a lie. Silence again, heavy, thoughtful. Then, from the far end, came a voice no one expected. I voted for the first stone in this building, said Harold Reese, one of the founding board members. His voice was thin but steady. I've watched this institution stray from the values we built it on. I didn't believe in Alexis when she came to us. But today, I see her holding the mirror to all of us. And I see the reflection I wish I'd seen sooner. With that, the call for a vote began. Each member wrote their decision on a slip, folded it, and placed it in the bowl passed around the table. When the final vote was read aloud, 6 to keep, 4 against, 1 abstention, Alexis felt her breath release slowly, like the letting go of a weight too long carried in silence. Her title remained, her power to act, restored. As the boardroom emptied, Jared approached her. That was the hardest room I've ever sat in. She smiled faintly. You should have seen the ones I built. But the reprieve didn't last. Madeline burst into the hallway, phone in hand, cheeks flushed from running. We've got a problem, she said, lowering her voice as she stepped close. Branch 27, Western Division. The training files, gone. Wiped clean. Alexis stared at her. When? 30 minutes ago, right before the audit team arrived. Alexis turned toward the window, where the city stretched out in layers of glass and movement. Henry wasn't done. Not yet. Not while his shadow still hung over the far corners of the system. And if she didn't act fast, what little remained of the truth could vanish for good. She looked at Eliza. Then Jared. We're going out there, tonight. No more screens. No more secondhand reports. This wasn't just a battle for leadership. It was a race against time. And Alexis had just decided she wasn't going to lose. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Alexis was already on her third cup of black coffee. Sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on the screen in front of her. The conference room had become a command center, papers scattered, laptops open, the air buzzing with low voices and the click of keyboards. Eliza stood nearby, quietly reviewing legal notes while members of the internal audit team filtered in and out, each carrying fragments of what they hoped would soon become undeniable truth. The mission was clear. Gather every scrap of data linked to Henry Dalton's off-record training sessions and lock it down before he could make it all vanish. In the last 24 hours, they had identified at least 5 branches that had hosted these shadow programs. But by the time the teams got there, the files were already gone, deleted or overwritten. Henry wasn't just covering tracks anymore. He was wiping the slate clean. Eliza suggested digging deeper, beyond the visible data. She proposed pulling metadata from the bank's central server infrastructure. Every login, every download, every file modification left a fingerprint, even if the files themselves had been erased. They got access, and that's when something strange emerged. One user account, buried beneath layers of encryption, stood out. The ID read, HKAdmin92, a name too deliberate to be a coincidence. The account had been used to access high-level directories and extract information. But the logs showed no deletions, just downloads, and the access point was even more peculiar. It didn't trace back to any known Harbor West device or location. It came from a co-working space on the edge of the city. The only person with authorized access to that space? Marcus Lee, a mid-level IT technician who'd once raised red flags about data anomalies and, according to HR notes, had gone voluntarily inactive 6 months earlier. Alexis didn't send anyone. She went herself. She and Eliza arrived at the building late in the afternoon. An unassuming red brick complex with a small front desk and no security camera in sight. They found Marcus in a narrow corner office, hunched over a keyboard, startled by their appearance like a man caught between fear and resignation. At first, he refused to speak, eyes darting, voice cracking. He kept repeating, "I'm not part of this anymore." I stayed quiet. That's all they asked. But when Eliza presented a printed copy of a court-issued witness protection assurance, signed and sealed, his hands trembled. Then, slowly, he reached into his drawer and placed a small, silver external hard drive on the desk. "I was told to clean things up," Marcus said quietly. "Change dates, make files look routine, create training templates that looked standard. At first, I thought it was just part of an update. But then, I started watching the internal meetings they sent, listening to the language." He paused, swallowed hard. I heard Henry say it out loud. That Alexis was too dangerous to the model. That they had to control the narrative. They wanted to make her look incompetent, irresponsible, even corrupt if they had to. Alexis said nothing. She didn't have to. Marcus continued. "I couldn't sleep after the press conference. I saw what they did to you. So I left clues in the metadata. Not to trap anyone, just to protect myself if they ever came after me. But now, I think I want them to come after me." Inside the hard drive was more than data. It was an archive of betrayal. Dozens of emails from Henry and his network, outlining directives on how to screen out undesirable profiles in recruitment and customer service. Recordings of secret meetings where terms like image filtering, profit shielding, and media leverage were used to discuss pushing Alexis out. Video footage of one branch manager rehearsing responses to potential PR fallout if their discrimination protocols were ever exposed. It was the black box of a crashed plane. Alexis didn't waste time. Within hours, she convened an emergency session with the Independent Ethics Committee, an external oversight group formed just 3 years earlier and, ironically, handpicked by Henry for its discretion. Eliza was ready. So was the evidence. 3 days later, Henry Dalton's termination was formally processed. Not quietly, not by mutual agreement, but in a legal statement that listed falsification of records, data manipulation, and conspiracy to undermine executive leadership as the primary charges. Alongside him, 4 other senior managers were suspended pending criminal investigation. News broke across every major network. Headlines praised Alexis's transparency. Analysts called it unprecedented, but Alexis didn't do interviews. She didn't take a victory lap. Instead, she requested one thing: a national live-streamed meeting with every Harbor West employee. The video started with a simple shot: Alexis, seated in the main auditorium, without podium or teleprompter. "I owe you more than an apology," she began. "I owe you the truth. What happened in our branches, in our systems, was not just a failure of oversight. It was a failure of values. My values." She looked straight into the lens, her voice firm but warm. "I built Harbor West with the hope that we could serve people who never felt welcome anywhere else. Somewhere along the line, some of us forgot that. We traded clarity for comfort, inclusion for profit, but that ends now." She laid out the new charter for Harbor West's future, a full restructuring of the regional leadership, mandatory civil rights education for every employee, and the creation of a new internal ombudsman program, directly accessible to all staff and customers. "I can't promise perfection," she concluded, "but I can promise this: no more shadows." Across the country, employees sat in break rooms, lobbies, and branch offices, watching her speak, some in silence, some with tears, but all of them saw something they hadn't seen in a long time. A leader who didn't just survive the fire. She walked back into it. For them. And this time, she brought the light with her. It had been a week since Henry Dalton's name was scrubbed from Harbor West Bank's leadership roster. News cycles began shifting to other stories. But for Alexis Moore, the battle wasn't over. In fact, the real work was just beginning. She sat alone in her office late into the evening. Light from the street lamps slicing across her desk through the blinds. Papers were stacked neatly in folders, each one a report, a timeline, a list of names. The human resources audit had come in that morning. At least 27 branches had implemented some version of the covert client scoring system, judging customers not by facts but by perceptions, clothing, accent, perceived income, even skin tone. It wasn't just one man's doing. It was a culture that had been silently spreading, hiding in meetings behind closed doors and euphemisms buried in training manuals. In a private strategy session with Eliza and a few close advisors, Alexis was presented with two paths. The first, a measured reform. Keep most of the staff. Roll out training programs. Implement oversight gradually. It would be more digestible for the public, less disruptive for daily operations. But it meant many of the mid-level managers who'd quietly enabled discrimination would stay on, with shiny certificates and new lingo. But the same old mindset. The second, a full-scale purge. Remove everyone with a track record of silence or complicity. Restructure the client evaluation process from the ground up. Replace outdated systems with human-centered policies. It would cost them, possibly millions in short-term disruptions, with likely investor backlash. Nobody said it out loud, but Alexis knew what they were really asking. Did she want to survive as a CEO or lead like the woman who built this company in the first place? That night, she drove back to the south side of Chicago. The house still stood, a little smaller than she remembered, paint peeling at the corners. She parked across the street and sat in silence. She could almost see her younger self on that front porch, watching her mother return from another rejected attempt to open a bank account. Back then, all her mother wanted was a chance, a place to start again, even with just a few dollars. But the teller had smiled and said, "We require proof of stable income." Alexis remembered the way her mother's fingers tightened around her purse strap, the way she swallowed whatever pride she had left. That memory had become her North Star, the seed of Harbor West. The next morning, Alexis returned to the office with a decision. No fanfare, no hesitations. "We go with the second option," she told the room. "We clean house." Madeline blinked. "If this backfires, they'll use this as a case study in how not to lead. You know that, right?" Alexis nodded, her voice firm. "And if I don't do it, then everything I claim to stand for is just a marketing slogan." By noon, a company-wide memo went out. Alexis called for an all-hands livestream, mandatory for every employee. From interns to executive VPs. The screen opened to her, standing in the central atrium. No podium, no script. "I know you're tired," she began, her tone steady. "I know some of you feel blindsided. And I know many of you are wondering what this means for your jobs, your teams, your futures. But I want you to hear this directly from me. We are not just restructuring for the sake of public image. We are rebuilding to protect the people who trust us with their lives and their dignity." She laid out the changes. A new internal justice board, led by civil rights professionals unaffiliated with the banking industry. The immediate suspension of all performance metrics tied to implicit bias factors, such as assumed dress code or client appearance. A new anonymous reporting system accessible to every employee, janitor to executive, designed to bypass the chain of command entirely. "I understand these changes might scare some of you," Alexis said, "but if we keep prioritizing comfort over conscience, we'll never become the kind of bank that changes lives." Reactions varied. Some executives looked pale. A handful of investors threatened to freeze capital. One board member even suggested in private that Alexis was pushing the company into activist territory. But on the ground floor, something else was happening. Branch employees from Phoenix to Pittsburgh started sending in messages of thanks. Clients wrote in with stories of being seen for the first time. That evening, as Alexis was sorting through follow-up reports, her inbox chimed with a new email from an internal address she didn't recognize. It was from a junior intern named Aisha Green. She introduced herself as Jamal Green's daughter, the same Jamal who'd once been forced out for defending an elderly customer from discriminatory treatment. Now, years later, his daughter was working at Harbor West as part of a university partnership program. Her message was short. "Today, for the first time, my father watched a Harbor West event on TV and didn't turn it off halfway through. He looked at me and said, 'Now justice isn't just a slogan.'" Alexis sat back, the weight of everything settling quietly on her shoulders. She didn't smile, not yet, but she closed her laptop with both hands, leaned back in her chair, and looked out the window, at a city that had both wounded her and shaped her. This wasn't the finish line. It was just the start of a longer, harder road. And now, she wasn't walking it alone. 3 months had passed since Alexis Moore made the decision that turned Harbor West Bank upside down, and then righted it again. The dust from the chaos had settled. Slowly, branch by branch, trust began to return. Customers who once walked past Harbor West without a second glance were now stepping inside, many for the first time. In neighborhoods that had long felt invisible to the financial world, the numbers told a new story. New accounts from underbanked areas had surged by 18%. Alexis walked through the South Bronx branch one Tuesday morning. She didn't announce her visit. She didn't wear a suit. And this time, nobody stopped her. The branch manager, a young woman barely 30, offered her coffee and introduced her to a client who had opened his first savings account at age 64. "They're not just numbers," the manager said quietly. "They're stories." Later that month, Alexis flew to New York to speak at a national civil rights conference. The ballroom buzzed with energy, full of activists, journalists, and community leaders from across the country. When her name was called, the applause was long and heartfelt. She accepted the award for courageous leadership not with a long speech, but with a few measured words. Fixing a system doesn't start with blaming others. It starts with asking, "What did I allow to grow in the dark?" The crowd stood. Some wiped away tears. Some nodded silently, as if they'd waited years to hear someone in power say that out loud. Backstage, Eliza found her leaning against a column, heels in hand, shoulders finally relaxing. "You did it," Eliza said. Alexis smiled. "For now." But Eliza's expression stayed serious. "We won this round, Lex. But let's not fool ourselves. People like Henry don't just disappear. They regroup. They wait." Alexis nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing. What they didn't know was that, a few miles away, in a private boardroom high above the city, a man in a gray suit sat watching footage from Harbor West's internal transformation. The video was paused on Alexis's press conference, the moment she looked directly into the camera and said, "We won't tolerate silence disguised as professionalism." He let out a soft chuckle. "Alexis Moore," he murmured, "not easy to take down. But she still believes in the idea of a system with rules." He tapped a pen against the desk. Thoughtfully, she may have scrubbed the surface clean, but beneath it, plenty of cracks left to slip through. The man wasn't Henry Dalton. Henry was finished, publicly. At least, this man had never set foot in a Harbor West office. But he knew numbers. He knew leverage. And most of all, he knew timing. Years ago, Alexis had turned down his investment offer, citing misalignment of values. He hadn't forgotten. Back at Harbor West headquarters, Alexis returned from her trip and walked into her office as the sun dipped below the skyline. She stood at the window, looking out across the city she had once feared would bury her, and now she was part of rebuilding. Her desk was quiet. No ringing phones. No urgent folders. Just a single piece of paper waiting for her review. It wasn't a policy draft or a legal update. It was a letter, addressed to all employees. She picked up the pen and signed it with steady hands. The memo would go out that evening. And it read, "To every one of you who chose courage over comfort, and truth over convenience, thank you. We were once just a bank. But now, we're something more. We're a symbol. And symbols don't get to compromise with the dark." As she set the letter down, Alexis felt it, not peace. Exactly, but a clarity that came from walking through fire and coming out still standing. Behind her, the city lights flickered on. In front of her, a long road still waited. But this time, she wasn't walking alone. Sometimes, it's not the loudest voices that bring change, it's the quiet, steady courage to do the right thing, even when no one's watching. Alexis didn't just reclaim her seat, she reclaimed the soul of a system built to serve, not to judge. What would you have done if you were in her shoes? Have you ever witnessed injustice in a place that was supposed to be fair? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in stories that reveal hidden truths and challenge the powerful, make sure to subscribe to Undercover Truths. We've got more eye-opening stories coming your way.